Hi everyone, my name is Merna. Welcome to Soul Struggles. We're going to be discussing everyday struggles that we go through in our lives, and especially during our current pandemic. Today we have with us Agaibi, who's a therapist with a master's and doctoral level training in counseling psychology and a focus in resilience, and she works with children, adolescents, and adults. Thank you for being here, Christine.
Thank you for having me.
Today's topic will be anxiety, phobias, and trauma. So our first question for you is, we have experienced a lot in 2020 and we have been tested. How can we understand anxiety and what it looks like during this pandemic?
Excellent question. And so similar to what we talked about last time with depression, lots of people can experience anxiety from here to there with related to things that they may be experiencing in their lives, circumstances that they may be experiencing, or they could be genetically predisposed to anxiety a little bit more. But especially now with this pandemic, we're really worried about a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. So to address things like phobias, phobias are things that are more really specific. And Americans have a lot of phobias. When they've done studies, they found them to be having specific phobias to things like thunder, things like the dentist, the number 13, believe it or not, spiders, heights, flying. Those are really specific things that people are worried about. And this is where the fears may come in from something that has actual no danger or very little danger, but people are still really worried about those things. And about 12.8% of Americans actually have fears related to those things I just mentioned. With things like COVID-19, because there is still a lot of information that's coming out and we're confused about what's happening and we don't know a lot of information and the science is still really fresh and new, we have fears about that as well because we don't know how to react to this pandemic because it's the first time we've experienced this in our lifetime. Mm-hmm. And so fear comes from a lot of lack of control where we're separated from our anchors of security, from our things that we're used to. And so those things become really anxiety provoking as well. Anxiety specifically is something that, and depression like we talked about last time, when it's a really condition that is diagnosed, is not something that we can just snap out of by saying, okay, I'm not going to be afraid of this anymore and just talk yourself out of it. You can't just try harder. And oftentimes depression and anxiety go together. They go hand in hand. There's similar scenarios between the two. And so sometimes people are dual diagnosed between anxiety and depression. But somewhere in the middle, there's excessive worrying that you can't turn off. There's excessive restlessness that you can't turn off. There's a lot of tiredness or stress that you can't turn off. Again, most people will be stressed about something but can turn it off at times and go do other things. But people that have a lot of generalized anxiety disorder, they can't turn it off. They can't turn off excessive worry about the past, the present, or the future. And it really interferes with their everyday life. So both with depression that we talked about last time and anxiety that we're talking about this time, it's excessive fear that you cannot turn off, and it interferes with your everyday life, it interferes with your functioning. So when somebody experiences panic, however, it's this intense fear that they may have over something really specific that we talked about, like we mentioned a couple minutes ago.
Our next question is, how do we know when we are anxious and are there different kinds of anxiety? Mm-hmm.
So again, there's sometimes an overlap with depression and anxiety, or at least they may be dual diagnosed together. But again, it's when you cannot turn off this excessive worry that you have. A lot of people will worry about things, especially with the pandemic, when people have lost jobs or can't pay their bills or things like that. So we'll worry about those things. But generalized anxiety is, again, you cannot stop worrying about things that happened in the past, in your current present life, or even about the future, and you can't turn it off. When it comes to things like panic, it's an intense fear, so intense that it sometimes has physical symptoms. People will feel their heart racing, they'll feel heart palpitations, they'll feel like they can't breathe or they're breathing too much, too quickly. So panic symptoms have a lot of physical symptoms. And we often tell people to try to go see their primary care physicians when they experience those, because we want to make sure that it's not something actually physical. And then we deal with it psychologically as well. So panic symptoms are really intense and they have a physical component as well. Some people may experience, especially with children, when I work with children, sometimes we'll see this, is separation anxiety, where they're unwilling to leave a caregiver, somebody that used to take care of them or loves them, and don't want to separate from an attachment figure. And this can sometimes be exacerbated during things like a pandemic, when you're really worried about your family and you're really worried about mom and dad leaving, and if you're going to school. So there may be a lot of separation anxiety, especially with children. Then some people may have some social phobias where they're fearing and fearing that they're going to have embarrassment issues, or that they're not going to be able to speak if they're in a group of people, and they're fearing humiliation, so they don't want to interact socially with others. And then when people experience trauma, this is when there's a real or perceived threat that someone has experienced. It could be a car accident, it could be something happening to them socially, could be something really dangerous that has happened to them. It's often related to abuse and domestic violence. But with trauma, people will experience things like flashbacks, nightmares. They may experience some physical symptoms like we talked about with panic. They may avoid things that will remind them of the trauma experience. So they'll avoid certain people or places or things that will remind them of the trauma. And so that's a form of anxiety that requires a lot of psychological and sometimes medical care as well, to help them to decrease the hyperarousal symptoms that they may feel, or the other stresses that they may feel. So yes, there are different types of anxiety, and it's not the same kind of anxiety that you may feel from something that is just in passing or something that's transient, but these things are much more consistent and long-term and need treatment to deal with these issues.
Okay. And at what point do we need to seek care?
Yeah, so again, when it's starting to affect functioning, similar to what we talked about with the depression, when it's starting to affect somebody's functioning and they can't go to work, or they can't go to school, or they can't get out of bed in the morning, or they can't interact with other people socially, now it's time to seek care from others. Again, anyone can experience these symptoms at any time. It does not mean that they're lacking in faith, or that they're weak, or that they have a certain issue. And it's just like any other medical illness where you need some treatment. You may need some treatment for this. But again, we want to look at things like frequency, intensity, and duration. Has the frequency of your anxiety increased? Is it just before it used to be, let's say, around a test, and now it's all the time? You can't get out of the house, you can't get up in the morning without feeling that anxiety. So the frequency has increased. The intensity may have also increased. So in the past, where it was just something that I felt here and there, or during a certain scenario in my life, if the intensity is increased and now you're feeling like you can't catch your breath and your heart's beating too fast and you're always stressed, that's the intensity has increased. And again, if the duration is increased, usually greater than 2 weeks is kind of the magic number that we look at. If you've experienced these symptoms for greater than 2 weeks at a time, and it's affected your functioning, and it's affected your social relationships, then it's time to seek some help.
Next question is, how can we help someone with anxiety during this pandemic and beyond, and what resources are available?
So at the end of these talks, there will be a resource slide that will pop up, so you can contact some therapists in your area, or people that can help you to deal with it more. But again, if it's friends and family, the most important thing is to support them, to encourage them to talk, to be there for your family, to stay connected with them, because oftentimes people want to isolate. They feel that they're troubling others with their anxiety or their depression, so they want to spend some time alone. So we want to encourage them to seek help. We want to encourage them to talk and to spend time with other people. We want to validate that their emotions are real and that they're important, and that we want to support them. We want to be there for them. We want them to know their strengths again, because oftentimes when people are anxious, and some people, for example, will get anxiety around a test, let's say, test-taking anxiety. We want to explain to them that you've studied, you've done well, you've done what you can to do well on this test. You can get support from teachers and professors and things like that. So we want to show them that there is support around them, that they're not supposed to feel all alone in this situation, that they're by themselves. Again, we want to create goals for them, teach them some calming techniques, things like prayer of the Agaibi, meditating activities, taking deep breaths. Those are all things that can calm down the anxiety in our system, and decrease the chemicals and the hormones in our body that are feeling over agitated by anxiety. Again, we want to tell them that this does not mean that they have weak faith, or that they're lacking in faith, or that they're weak or anything like that, but that we can help them with the proper channels, with the proper support, with the proper therapy.
And next we have, how can we count on our spirituality and faith in God when dealing with anxiety?
Yeah, so the Bible talks a lot about our faith and our faith practices, and there's anxiety kind of verses kind of throughout the Bible. But one is that courage is not the absence of fear, but that we don't kind of give into that fear. It's a mastery over fear. So courage doesn't mean that there's no fear at all. Courage is actually a choice. We can confront the pain that we're feeling. And so there's psychological character strengths that talk a lot about courage, as well as the Bible talking about courage. And so that kind of intersects in the two. There's physical courage where we can face hardship. Our martyrs, for example, faced hardship, but they weren't fearful in the face of that hardship. There can also be moral courage where we're facing difficulties over things like personal losses or discouragements or disappointments with resilience. So that's kind of a more moral courage. The Bible tells us things in like 2 Timothy where it says, God did not give us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and love and sound mind. And so he's with us in our struggles. And we can turn to, again, people in the Bible who have experienced a lot of courage during times of difficulty. Some examples that come to mind, obviously, is David and Goliath. He was able to stand in front of this giant Goliath and not be afraid. Esther was able to stand in front of the king and not feel fearful either. And her goal there, she had a goal, which is to save her people, which was more powerful to her than the fear of standing in front of the king. So the lessons from the book of Esther, she stood boldly in front of the king. She had a voice. She used her voice to advocate for herself. And so when we're fearful, we should use our voice to advocate for ourselves and what we want to come out of that situation. And also knowing that God will fight on her behalf, we should also know that God is going to fight on our behalf, and that we can take action knowing that he will be faithful to deliver us. There's other lesser known examples from the Bible. Shiphrah and Puah and the Hebrew midwives in the book of Exodus. They were told to slay they were midwives, so they were told to slay any Hebrew male that was born in their care. And they defied the king's orders and let the male Hebrew boys live. So defying the orders of the king at that time could have had serious consequences. So we can see from these examples that we can be courageous even in the times of difficulty, but that doesn't mean that anxiety can't also get support and help from professionals who can help with a medical perspective, from a psychological perspective, to help us to process some of our fears and also to find solutions that can help us to become more and more courageous and bold and deal with our anxieties. Again, from a character strengths perspective, from a psychological perspective, there's the concept of courage and bravery, perseverance, that we, whatever we feel today, if we persevere, we can overcome that struggle day after day. And we can face it with facts. A lot of times people will catastrophize and get that situation out of control. So we want to bring the situation back to facts. What are the facts of the situation that have helped us in the past to cope with that difficulty, and then focusing again on positive feelings, talking about what positive feelings surround us, what our strengths are. Those can all be things that can help us with anxiety. Another thing that can help us with anxiety is practicing gratitude. A lot of times we become hyper-focused on what is making us anxious, and we tend to neglect things like things that we're grateful for. And research shows that when we focus on gratitude, we focus on positive emotions, we open our mind up to better problem-solving skills. So in order to problem solve out of an anxious situation, it's very helpful if we're gracious and we can focus on problem solving a little bit as well.
Okay. And for our last question, what advice do you have for young Orthodox Christians who suffer from anxiety?
Okay. So again, hope anchors the soul. So it's really important to know that even though we have things that cause us struggle, things that are causing us to be anxious, things that are causing us a lot of difficulty, we have a hope and anchor in God. And so for Orthodox Christians specifically, we can turn to the Gospels, we can turn to the Psalms. There's a lot of, the Psalms mean to praise, and so we can turn to those powerful tools to help us to cope with the difficulties. Again, there's many stories through the Bible of people that have experienced anxiety and distress, and David the prophet actually talked about many anxieties within me, so actually using the word anxiety. But the Lord delivered me out of them all. And so we have to know that tomorrow doesn't have to be like today. This doesn't have to last forever. And to lean on the stories from the Bible, from our saints, from those who have experienced a lot of struggles, to know that we can be resilient, that we can have the right attitude with the right faith. But also, again, knowing that just because we're feeling anxiety doesn't mean that we have a lack of faith, or that if we pray harder, it'll just magically go away. Sometimes we need support from professionals to give us either medication to adjust the hormones and the chemicals in our mind, and sometimes we also need therapy to give us the tools to talk ourselves out of those situations and to reframe our thinking away from the catastrophizing, away from the negativity, into more positive thinking, and to talk about where those struggles are coming from. So it's really important to get help from professionals as well, to lean on professionals, spiritual professionals like priests, but also psychological professionals who can help us to deal with the struggles that we're facing and to cope with them a little bit differently.
Thank you so much, Christine, for being
Thank
here.
you.
My name
Thank
is
you.
Merna. Thank you for watching Soul Struggles, and we'll see you next time.